Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to begin the second keynote session in just a moment. I'm just allowing folks to get in from the auditorium. But we want to take full advantage of this hour with Professor Popkewitz. So I don't want too much time to delay. I'm Kevin Kester from Seoul National University, and it's my great pleasure to serve as the chair for this session. It's my distinct honor. Thank you, my students. It is my distinct honor to introduce Professor Thomas Popkewitz, a renowned professor at the School of Education at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and former chair of the Department of Curriculum and Instruction at the University of Wisconsin. Professor Popkewitz is widely recognized for his groundbreaking work on the sociology and the politics of education, curriculum studies, and international comparative education. Having published over 40 books and more than 300 journal articles and book chapters, he's a very prolific author. His scholarly contributions have significantly shaped critical discourse on knowledge, power, and governance in education. And today, Professor Popkewitz will address the topic of beyond human agency, exploring AI's challenges and potentiality in internationalized education through post-humanism. Through this lecture, we expect to gain deep insights into how AI and post-humanist perspectives invite us to rethink the very foundations of internationalized education. So please join me in giving a warm round of applause to welcome Professor Thomas Popkewitz.
I want to thank the organizers of this conference to invite me. For those who don't know, it's my first time here, which is a delight for me because I have so many people over the years that I've worked with that it's wonderful to be here and see their home as well. The title is a little pretentious, and but that's life. I'm trying to figure out which way I should work this. What I'm going to do today is think historically about the school, but also historically about the politics of modernity, and then to use that as a way of thinking about how you ask questions about AI, which is here. I mean, in honor of coming here, I started listening to a lot of podcasts of people who are developing AI. And it's amazing what is there now that we don't see in terms of AI. And I want to start with a very simple comment. And that it maybe partially is related to the fact that I'm in a department of curriculum and instruction, where everyone talks about learning and learning sciences. And I want to say that historically, schools are not about learning. It's about making kinds of people. And at agency, which is the other part of the title, is really a theory of practice that emerges in relationship to the Enlightenment for those who want to look at it. And here I'm going to use some work in the history of science from Lorraine Daston and Peter Gallatin. It's in training subjectivity. And in that, and this is also part of the historical part, and if it sounds complex, it probably is. One of the legacies of the Enlightenment is a particular kind of comparative reason that still inhabits much of educational research, but also the social sciences. And I want to explore those kinds of ideas as they relate to, which is the end of this talk, AI. And I'm going to pose some questions about AI because it reminds me of a friend of mine who was one of the inventors of the internet. And when he was working with people, it was called the ARPANET at that time, which was to speed up communication among science. They had no inclination of how that thing was going to be used. And so it's an empirical question, but not empiricist. Okay, so AI for me is historically a new relational space of the politics of modernity. The politics is in governing conduct about who we are, who we should be, and who is not the we. That is dangerous to modernities and should be plural, hopes. That's a mouthful, I could probably stop there. I'm going to focus in the latter part on AI as a knowledge or system of reason, again, about making kinds of people. But that's going to come at the very end because I have to sort of build up why I'm thinking the way I'm thinking. I had to do that for me too. Okay, so again, it's an ambitious title. And I was writing a book recently. It was called The Impracticality of Practical Research. And I was visiting a friend in Melbourne who said to me, how come you're not using the traditional way of talking about science, which is the debates about rationalism and empiricism? And I had to think about it because I really never thought about it that way. And then when I read it, I realized that it was part of a particular kind of analytical thinking, what separated science into these two kinds of forms, one inductive, one deductive. And I had to say, that's not what I'm doing. What I'm doing is thinking about science, and here I'm using an art historian's work in Madison, which looks at the origin of, or the precursors of modern science, where they're like, she compares it to the magic lanterns of the 17th century, projections. And I want to argue that what research, but also schools, do are projections, and they're projections of kinds of people. And these are three kinds of people. And each of them, if you want, they're really interesting historical arguments, discussions about how these ways of thinking of people emerge. The creative child, the engaged child, and the sort of at-risk child, the juvenile delinquent child. And in them, you can see it's not only a cognitive thing, it is also a projection of a way in which you begin to see and feel and think about the good and the not so good child, but also the teacher. One more element of this as a sort of beginning is to think about how the school curriculum, but also its research, which has been most of my interest lately, to think about science, the social sciences. And one example is almost every school in the world teaches kids Euclidean geometry. And there is a math researcher in Chile. Her name is Melissa Andretti Molina, who thought about Euclidean geometry as, first of all, there are multiple kinds of geometry. So you have to ask, why is the school teaching Euclidean geometry? And what she argues, basically, it's a way in which you see a two-dimensional space with fixed objects. That is, Galilean objects, things that don't change. So you think of the child as a creative child. That's a fixed object. And she says, what you learned in seeing the world through Euclidean geometry is a two-dimensional space with, again, fixed objects, which she argues is a way of having sight that is seen. But the sight is also sightless. And my example of the sightless and why I'm saying that, because I like to play with, if I get to it, there it is. I like to sail. One of the lovely things we just talked, some people here have been or grew up in Madison, where I live. It's a very lovely city surrounded by lakes, and I have a boat. There's my boat, and there's one of my daughters and me. If I use Euclidean geometry as a way of knowing what I'm doing on the lake, my boat would crash into the rocks. Because you cannot use, sort of, Euclidean geometry, by the way, is your GPS in the car. That's a Euclidean way of seeing. And so you have to understand that when you're going to school and when you're doing research, you're learning about how people should be seeing the world, but also how they should be in the world. And so schools are about making kinds of people, not about learning. And I want to also talk out here another example, which is from a box of food from my closet. It's called Kellogg's Nutri-Grain. Kellogg's Nutri-Grain is a way in which science projects the idea of a healthy person. But if you look at the images on the box, not the one on the right, but the athlete, the basketball player, and also the charts which tell you this is about health, you're learning a particular way of thinking about what it is health. My watch tells me every morning if I'm healthy. It tells me by numbers, it tells me by percentages and other things like that. And this is a projection, and the projection, and why I'm using this, it's a projection, and I'll get to a little bit later, which you begin to see certain images and narratives about who you are, but also what you're supposed to feel about what you are. So it's just not a cognitive thing, it also is an affective element of life. And I can go more into it, but this is the idea of sort of a healthy life, but also what is the good life? And why am I saying it like that? Because one of the elements of modern social science, but also education, it carries in it utopic images about what is the good life, but also, and this I'll get to, it carries images about what isn't the good life. Because when I put this, there we go, in that idea of what is a healthy, these two images, I don't have to say very much about them. They're about what you shouldn't do, or if you should do, and if you do, you feel guilty about. And so that in the very norms and values and also the organization of the knowledge that you have about yourself is also about what you shouldn't be yourself. That is, it's a very comparative notion. And this is a very particular kind of reasoning that becomes very prominent in the late 1800s, actually earlier than that. And it changes. So, and what I want to get to is AI is changing how we begin to think in this comparative way about who we are and who we're not. Now, as a counterexample is the idea of Yangshan, which is a very interesting, different way of thinking about what it means to be healthy. It is not about the same as the Nutri-Grain bar. It's about a notion of spirit and the cultivation of collective disciplining. And now the two, the left and the right, the science and the Yangshan, for example, in today's world, they coexist in ways that are not the same as classical, say, Chinese thinking. But I'm not going to get into that today because I can't. So why is all this important? Because pedagogy, teaching, learning, the psychologies of the child are projections, and those projections are phantasmograms. What do I mean by that? They're beautiful images and narratives that are imaginary, that get projected, and I'll show you why I say they're imaginary. They're inventions and fabrications that get projected through the teaching of the school about kinds of people. The creative, the engaged, the juvenile delinquent, the lack of motivated child. These are all part of the projections of the school. And I use the word double gestures to point and think about how these things are not opposites. They're built into the same phenomena. And a simple example of that is that very common in American literature today, but also in European, is to talk about the successful child is the motivated child, the engaged child. But if you think about those two words, embedded in it is also what it's not, the child who's not motivated, the child who's not engaged. So you have in the same phenomena both what seem as opposites, but they're not. They're built into the same notions of representation. Now, all this, by the way, we'll get to AI eventually, because AI builds that in, but you don't see it anymore because of the way in which it gets built in through the algorithms and also the big data. All right, the analogy. I have a friend here from Shanghai. When I gave this analogy the other day, she said, oh, I talk about, was it a cheesecake? I'm using a chocolate cake. If you think about the creative child, it is like a cake. I mean, there are limitations to it. I need some water. Can I have some water, please? Oh, thank you. There's a very interesting book, if anyone's interested, by Kat Martin, who's in art education at the University of Porto. And she just wrote a book about the emergence of the idea of creativity in art education. And if you want to think about art education, you have to, and the creative child in art, you have to understand how a number of different historical factors become woven into it to make it possible to see the creative child. But also in that notion of creative child are notions of coloniality, notions of difference, and notions of exclusion. So why the cake? When you bake a cake, and I like to bake cakes, you put a lot of ingredients together. The ingredients for me is a lot of chocolate, and different kinds of chocolate. And you have flour, water, oil, and so on. Notice how I'm talking about it as individual ingredients. I mix them together, I put it in the oven, and when it comes out, you don't see those ingredients. You have ways of talking about, oh, it's a chocolate cake, but that chocolate cake is not the same as when I put it in as chocolate. It's something different. And so that when you talk about the child in the school as a creative, it's built upon multiple different ingredients get mixed up and historically become something to talk about who the child is. That's a phantasmagram. That is, it's an imaginary way of saying, and I'll get to this a little bit later when I talk about adolescence, which is another fabrication. And here, if you want, you can say I'm drawing upon the work of Deleuze when he talks about a rhizome, or Barad when she talks about it in agential realism, and a whole bunch of other things which relate to a way of thinking out of a certain kind of logic that emerges at the end of the 19th century in terms of the new welfare states and planning societies. So in this idea of the cake, this idea of the healthy person is built upon multiple different ingredients. There's political discourses that says you have to put the ingredients on the package, political discourses that tell you how the science measures nutrition and so on, and a whole bunch of other things, including in this one, the notion of health and the race, notion of family, and notion of gender, and also notions of race in the US. If I take this photograph, which is from an American grocery item, and I bring it to Sweden, people there do not recognize the imagery because there's a whole different notion of race and racialization there. Okay, let me give a couple of historical examples of how the school begins to develop kinds of people. And I'll start with a very famous person in the US, but also is one of its major exports in relationship to education, called John Dewey. John Dewey was at the University of Chicago in the late 1800s, early 1900s, ran a very interesting experimental school. And the reason it was called an experimental school was because of the rise of science. science not only as a way of understanding the world, but also as a way of thinking about what was wise about the world. Today we talk about science as wise, we talk about scientific evidence. It's a way of justifying things through thinking science provides the answer. As a little sidelight, for those of you who are very, like the idea of scientific evidence, Lorraine Daston has an interesting, she's a historian of science, article about the emergence of scientific evidence. And she argues it emerges in the Catholic Church in the, I think, 16th century as a way of proving miracles were things of the church and getting ways of arguing against people who were arguing that miracles were being performed outside the church. Anyway, back to John Dewey. John Dewey was very heavily influenced by the Hull House. There were settlement movements because of immigration to the US at that time, which is also true, by the way, throughout Northern Europe and Southern Europe, and also Latin America. And the idea of the Hull House was to observe immigrants to find ways of changing them so that they can be American citizens. Dewey's work, I lost some of the text, but that's okay, is very much related to that. And Dewey's work, there's somewhere a quote under all these different images of where he talks about democracy is the same as the way Christ thought. Dewey was a Protestant reformer. This is all part of the ingredients in what's called pragmatism in Dewey's work. In other words, what gave it intelligible, made it intelligible, what was the enunciation of a whole series of historical ways of thinking that Dewey could then begin to speak like this. There's also corollary work being done in Europe, which we hear less about. A different psychology at that time, and Dewey was in what's called an anthropological psychology, was the work of G. Stanley Hall. G. Stanley Hall was concerned with something which probably most of us are familiar with, is the idea of being an adolescent. The idea of an adolescent was, how do you deal with the transition from being a child to a youth? It's a way of thinking. It's somehow you can think about it and plan it. And Hall said, let me think of the child as an adolescent. People did not think of children that way. So Hall's book, and you can read the title, which is really very interesting, is another recipe. Hall said, and also Hall was writing at a time where in the US, again, this is the turn of the 19th century, there was a school being built every day. There was more money being spent on education than the total Defense Department budget, which wouldn't be said today. But there was a sort of a crisis people were feeling because the school that kids were going to, the common school, the school for everyone, was a school where built for elites. And so these kids were having problems. And they were having problems, but the problems weren't only theirs. And he said, let's have this idea of adolescent to talk about how the school can deal with these children. And then also, this is an institutional analysis. Many of his graduate students went on into the schools, and psychology became the dominant way of thinking about curriculum and teaching. Before that, psychology, there was sort of a psychology there, but it wasn't scientific psychology. So that the emergence of psychology as a science emerges with and becomes part of the recipe of the modern school. But read the title. It's really, I think, very interesting. It says adolescence is psychology. And then it says this relation to physiology, anthropology, and sociology. These, by the way, this was the time that the modern science were emerging as formal disciplines to think about society and planning society. And they would, for those of you who have not read about this, it's really interesting to realize that modern social science formed as a way of dealing with a so-called crisis of different societies as a way of trying to manage it. Usually in the US, most of it dealt with urban education and urban schools. So it is dealing with the pathologies, if I use that word. But now read the rest of it, because you can understand what the issues were that were built into why Hall was thinking about calling a child an adolescent. There was a problem of sex. What does it mean? A lot of young women were getting pregnant, and the social mores around the control of sex was falling apart in urban areas, at least felt. There was a lot of crime, at least thought to be crime. Urban conditions were not very good, by the way, at that time. And then also there was a feeling of people falling away from religion. And so adolescent was a way of correcting all these, and in a sense bringing back a notion of moral order. And then at the bottom, all this comes into the modern school. And if you open the book and you start reading Hall, and this is 1898, you can see a number of different things that begin to make the text reasonable for people at that time. There was a hope of the future, that science would bring it. There's a Danish historian who writes about what's called the technological sublime in the US. In this period where you start seeing Niagara Falls or waterfalls, skyscrapers, the telegraph, electricity, not only as technological things, but also as carrying the imagination of the nation. That is, that science would bring the good life. There were also fears. The fears were of urban life, what Hall called the urban hothouse. There was also fears of unbridled capitalism. That is, people, today you don't think of the names there, but Rockefeller, Ford, Carnegie, these are very people who made a lot of money at that time, and they made their money in ways that didn't care about workers. Basically, there were no laws. This is a period in the US history that was laissez-faire in the sense of there were no restrictions. If you built a house, there were no zoning laws. That changes, and Hall is part of this period. For those of you who read about American progressive education was part of a political movement of the formation of the modern welfare state in the US called progressivism. And one of the interesting things for me moving to Wisconsin is that was the heart of progressivism. And then there were also issues of gender, where Hall, and also issues of eugenics, of how you tell the difference between different groups through ideas of eugenics. People are born that way with certain kinds of good genes and others don't, and you try to do something to those who don't have it. Okay, so even in that, you have this idea of kinds of people, and I call them phantasmograms. They're imaginary things that carry in it both image of the good life and the good person, but also images of those who are not. And here I'm bringing up the work, which actually is co-writing with me, she's sitting over here, which is Jihan Huang. This is from her research that she's doing on multiculturalism. She's trying to understand how multiculturalism emerges in Korea as something that is exported from the US, but in it carries certain notions of race and racialization that was born out of American conditions, and how those conditions begin to change, and how they also changes in the way in which you begin to see the notion of race as it enters into Korea, which is not or something different from what is in the US, and how to recognize that. And here is the discussion of both in the US, the emergence of multiculturalism, which is dealing with the notion of how you think about differences in the US, and how you develop ways of recognizing those differences, which was different from the idea of previous ways of understanding the schools. Okay. I think this is almost the next to last point, or if the last point, before I get to AI. I promised I would, and I will. And this is also part of the recipe, because it also is very much, for me, very important, because people take it for granted, in education in particular. And it's what I call the alchemy of the school. The alchemy, if you look at the photograph on the right, were 17th century people who tried to take metals and turn it into gold as a way of finding the ultimate truth of life. And that ultimate truth was tied to Christianity. The school is an alchemy, and it is also, why am I saying it's an alchemy? Because what it does is take things like science, and here I took Google Images, very good. Someone working with computers, let's say they're computer scientists, and there's a building on my campus, and there's probably a building on this campus that has people in computer science. And they work in a certain way. When I say work in a certain way, there's a culture to how they work, and there's probably multiple cultures in the computer science, not just one, because people who are working on certain problems work on it differently than working on others. And I could say the same thing for chemistry, and I say the same thing for other sciences. And I'll get to that in a minute. So what happens? Educators go into the building, and my imagery is they take a camera, and they take pictures of people working there. They load the camera up. I call a train. In my campus, you could walk across the street. And they go into the education building, and they take all those pictures, they put it onto a desk, and they say, aha, that's science. And the pictures become science. So it's a surrogate science. It's not what people are doing. It's not the culture of computer science, but it's images that you have that are put up into and collected, and that becomes what's real about science. And then it's put into teaching, it's put into, we call it professional expertise today, where you take pedagogical knowledge, if you know that literature in teacher education, and you say that's what a teacher needs to be able to teach computer science or chemistry and so on. And so what it does is take a whole bunch of different things, puts it into a whole different image that's not what computer sciences are doing. And again, if you don't like the way I'm talking about it, read the history of science, read the sociology of science, and you'll get a better picture of why what we do in education when we develop models of teaching of mathematics or science or math or music are really phantasmograms that project images of children that have nothing to do with science, nothing to do with math, except the formal symbolic logic of those disciplines. So why is that important? Lei Zheng, who's actually here, I could have her come up and talk about her work, did a beautiful study of, by the way, I've been very lucky, and a lot of the people I've been lucky with are here, of working with people who have done some really beautiful work in a whole bunch of areas that made whatever I'm saying today possible. And I'll probably hopefully mention all of them, and if not, I mean to. What Lei did was say, how is it possible, I don't know if this is exactly what she did, but you can tell me later if I'm lying, that you have, if you think about the sciences, astronomy is not the same as molecular biology, it's not the same as physics, okay? They're really very different. They have different criteria of adequacy, they have different ways of collecting data and what data are, and so on. And she says, how is it possible that we take all these differences and make it into a oneness we call science, and we call it science education? And she went back into the 1950s and examined the Club of Rome and also how they began to think about the idea of teaching what we now call STEM. And realized that, again, using my language from before, it's a recipe that's very different from previous, and also not anything related to science, but it was related to cybernetics, which was a new science that was emerging there, plus a lot of other things that were going on. And so that when you teach science, and if you look carefully at science literature, it takes for granted that the propositions and generalizations that are being taught is what science is, and the focus is on making kinds of people. I did a study in the US, which was, the book was called Struggling for the Soul. And I went to urban and rural schools, and I observed, well, for a whole year, different schools in different parts of the country. And it was really interesting. When I observed science lessons, the science lessons were not about science. They were about getting kids to talk about their social life, and trying to make them feel better about who they were or not feel good about who they were. But it wasn't about science. These were primary schools. All right. Let me give you one more example of a phantasmagram. And this comes out of PISA. I've been fairly lucky to have good friends, and good friends in Sweden. And we had a project. The Swedish government was trying to establish an institute to examine what they call secondary analysis, which is PISA. And they asked this friend of mine, who asked me to work with him, to study these international assessments. And so I studied PISA. And it's really interesting, if you look at PISA, you could see they talk about scientific literacy. Scientific literacy is a way in which they talk about whether children have adequate knowledge or inadequate. Then they compile it into aggregates, and they say whether Korea or whether the US or Mexico or China today, whether their children are performing properly. When you look at the notion of literacy and you look at the way in which it's constructed, you realize it has nothing to do with science. It has to do with psychometrics. It has to do with the alchemy I was just talking about with the curriculum and a whole bunch of other things, including the relationship of different kinds of notions of probability. And in that, they begin to construct something, a phenomena called literacy, that has nothing to do with science, but it has to do with the internal recipe that's being used that becomes represented as science. So this is a kind of person. And in this kind of person, this is about mathematical literacy, is a kind of person also is about who's not that kind of person. That is the person who's outside the norm of one way or another. All right. So what have I done so far? I'm not sure. But one of the things I tried to do is say schools are about making kinds of people. In that notion of kinds of people is the training of how you begin to think about who you are and who you're not, what I called earlier trained subjectivity. What science does and produces, the research in education that does this, but it's not only in education. They create, and I haven't talked very much about this, but patterns of recognition, so that when you look at the adolescent, you have a way of thinking that is an adolescent versus not an adolescent. But in that is another thing called expectations of experience. Because when you look at the adolescent, you have not only a way of seeing who the child is, you also have a way of expecting what the child should become, what Agamben calls potentialities. So that the school, when you talk about the adolescent and you talk about the creative child, it's not only about the present, it also is about some utopic image of what you desire, what is desired. When I say desired, it's not just you, it's built into the way the knowledge forms. That projects into it a way in which you think about who is and isn't that child. That is, there's a notion of moral order. And for me, and this goes back to the first comment, this is part of what I think about is the politics of modernity. And this is where AI, it seems to me, begins to become important because it has the potentiality of changing that way of creating kinds of people, but also training subjectivity. So its implications are potentially, I'm using that word, profound. Okay. This is a book by someone named Espinosa. She's an Italian organizational theorist. And she says we compare ourselves to machines and we don't like it if they don't seem to be winning, if they seem to be winning. And our endeavor is to build intelligent machines. We do not just wonder whether they succeeded, but if the machines are becoming too smart. And then we hear this a lot about the complaints about AI and what it's doing and so on. But that's not what I'm concerned about, and it wasn't what she's concerned about either. She says, is this really what we have to worry about? And I'm going to argue it's not. And I'm agreeing with her, but not exactly going where she went with her book. And I'm going to use the analogy here of Ford Motor Company. I did see some Fords in between all the Hyundai and the Kias outside. When Ford built his factory in the 1920s. He built it in the Ohio Valley of the US. And he couldn't get people to come to work for him. For those of you who don't know, Ford invented what's called the assembly line. We take it for granted now. What the assembly line is basically is to take apart making a car or any other thing, and then trying to simplify the process of manufacturing so each part can be done independently. To do that, if you're a worker, you have to begin to think about how you work with independent parts, not what was there before. What was there before were people who were making carriages. People who made carriages were people who were craftsmen. They were men. To be a craftsman, my father was a craftsman, but he was a carpenter. And if he picked up a hammer, the hammer became an extension of the way he thought about what he was making, all right? To work in an assembly line, you don't think about what you're making. You think about the part and is it being fit in and are you doing it within a time scheme? So what Ford had to do was, in a sense, retrain subjectivity of the worker so that they could be in the factory and feel satisfaction about it. Because they were no longer making carriages. They were putting parts into an assembly line. It's this analogy I want to use to think about AI. Is it, in a sense, a modern version, not of an assembly line, but of something that is retraining our subjectivity in a way of thinking about who we are, but also, in a sense, what we think is of the good life, because that's part of who we are. Okay. And I'm going to talk about, sort of quickly, what is this new subjectivity? And involved in thinking about AI, for me, we have to think about how AI, in a sense, is creating new notions of memory and forgetting, how information is being used, and also, and what's interesting about the Ford assembly, is you also begin to emerge the category of worker and also unemployment, which were in categories that people used before then, but also to distinguish between notions of work and leisure, which is also a very modern concept. But let's get to AI. Okay. Yesterday, Professor Steiner said there's no data without theory. I want to reiterate that. AI embodies theories. They're not theories that people intentionally put there. Yesterday, Professor Steiner mentioned Carl Pearson's correlation coefficient R. For those who don't know, which is this sort of the curve that you have standard deviations, one of the reasons he did that was a theory. And the theory had to do with British colonialism. He was very concerned about proving that the British were superior to the South Africans. And this was part of the historical construction in which this notion of emerges. So it isn't just a statistical theory, it carries in it other kinds of social norms and values that are embedded in it. My other example of this is American polling. In the US, we do a lot of polling, especially when it comes to the elections and things like that. That emerges in the 1920s, and why does it emerge? Historically, it emerges because there was a rethinking of American representational democracy. As America became more complex in its industrialization and more populous in its number of people, the idea of direct representation no longer was possible. The early American context, 18th century, was where people gathered in their local, usually town hall or church, and they made decisions about social life. By the turn of the 20th century, that was impossible. What the poll does is provide a way in which people can think about representation, even though it wasn't direct, because the polling provided a sense of being involved and having your interests being represented by the poll itself. And so the emergence of the poll, the survey poll, the political poll, has this historical background which made it intelligible as a way of thinking about how you judge political attitudes and feelings. So again, there's no, AI embodies a certain kind of theory, and that's what I want to get to eventually. We have my graduate students and I, and also we visiting fellows, we meet every Wednesday, and we were playing with AI one day, and we started to ask all different questions. And when I say questions, not questions of a different epistemic order, that carried with it different ways of thinking about the world. They weren't just saying, you know, how old are you, but also asking about, for example, going back to something I said before, if you want to understand Dewey's writing, how do you understand how it enunciates certain kinds of historical conditions? That's a particular kind of question that involves a particular way of answering. It isn't just, okay. And we asked all different questions, and when the AI, this is the screenshot of the AI, they all put it in the same grammar, syntax, and punctuation. Why is that important? Because it's a translation, but it's a translation into a particular mode of reasoning. This is a mode of reasoning that is very analytical. There's nothing wrong with being analytical, but also has in it a certain notion of representation and order that took different modes of reasoning and brought it in and standardized it in a particular way. So I think it's really important to understand that what AI is doing, it's built upon a certain way of organizing how information is to be presented, which is itself a way of thinking about what the world is about. It's not that AI is wrong, but it is producing a certain kind of subjectivity. And so that's a question that I think needs to be continually asked about it, because it is a standardizing, but not standardizing. It's a funny kind of standardizing. It's a standardizing epistemically with uncertainty that allows you to deal with different variations. So that if I go on Alibaba or if I go on Amazon, I'm getting different answers, but it's a standardization about how those answers are being produced. And if I don't ask my question right, I'm not going to get an answer, actually. All right, I said all that. And so that one of the questions that needs to be asked is that what kinds of people are being made in the operation of this? And I'll get a little bit more into this, but what kinds of knowledge are being reproduced? What are the questions that are made possible and which are excluded or rendered unintelligible? How does the algorithm structuring questions create projections of difference in education imagination? So AI, I'm in a sense playing with here as an actor. It is an actor that's not a human actor, but it is acting by the way in which it organizes and creates a grammar and also a syntax. It's acting on us because it gives us a way in which we are, in a sense, being asked to see and think about things. And it's also really important, which is really interesting to me. I was listening, I was in Gothenburg. There was a panel, and all of them, these are people involved in AI and using it in, not in education. They were actually mostly, well, they were around the campus, but not in education. And they all talked about the data being produced, with ever questioning what is the notion of data that's being produced. And one of the things that AI does, and that's why you have these big, at least in the US, these big energy production places that feed the big data factories that are being built, is that what AI does is collect data that's already existed. So in other words, the past becomes then the way in which information is being produced for today. And that past is being produced through a particular way of organizing it and making it into information. And so that's, you have to ask, how does innovation come? And I don't have an answer to this, but it's really interesting to think, one of the problems of innovation is to think outside the box. But if the box is already formed for you, how do you get out of that box? There's a wonderful quote from Albert Einstein who said, the important thing of science is to think about what the question is And so if the question is already formed by the way in which the information is designed for you, then where does, I use this as a historical sense of innovation emerge? And in that, by the way, is also really issues of what become memory and forgetting. I don't have here, but it was really interesting when I was doing the work with OECD and PISA to understand how the information about schools and assessments of kids and the graphs and charts carry with it notions of what is the memory, what past, what is the past, and what is the present. That's very different from earlier notions of memory and forgetting. So it creates new ways of thinking. And here I'll read this because it's nicely written and I didn't write it. AI's primary capability lies not in genuine intelligence or emotional understanding, but in highly sophisticated communicative skills, patterns of recognition, linguistic fluency, and responsiveness. Communication interactions with AI produce effective intensities in educational settings, regardless of AI's ability to think, feel, or intend, emotional outcomes, or effective dimensions at all. I should say that AGI is actually being able to build in thinking, feeling, intended emotional outcomes. At least that's from the podcast. If I have to, it's nice to walk dogs in the morning. You listen to a lot of podcasts. So algorithmic interactions can train subjectivities, shaping learners' emotional, social, and epistemological orientations, shaping distinct educational subjectivities, capacities, and potentialities. These are questions and not assertions of what they are, but of things that begin to think about if you want to think about education. Jihan's research is also exploring this in some ways through, for example, what happens and how do you begin to think of race when you think of it through AI? What is it, what are the parameters that begin to form it as an information? What are the theoretical underpinnings that begin to be culled out of the way AI masses information, in a sense, in these outlines that we put? And what does it begin to omit and as ways of thinking about it? Okay, guess what? I'm almost done. So the question is, what is agency? Again, back to the initial, I should look at my watch. Oh, I'm okay, I have 4 minutes. Agency is not something that's there that you do. Agency is a very theoretical concept that says this is agency and this is not. Agency is a historical concept that becomes very important in the Enlightenment and becomes more and more important in the idea of notions of participation and notions of democracy, notions of freedom, and so on. But it's a theoretical concept. So what becomes the notion of agency, which is back into our title? With the introduction of AI, how does it get reformed and reformulated? In the history of science, it's really interesting to see that, and I'm not talking about the social sciences here, that in the sciences there are different notions of nature, but in those notions of nature are always notions of moral order. So the idea of agency is built upon those relationships of some notion of nature, and they're not nature in the sense of innate, but nature that relates to social relations, and notions of moral order. And I'm going to conclude with this more general statement, which is the history of the human science in Western education. It's a projection of making kinds of people and comparing people that exclude in efforts to include. I didn't emphasize that as much here, but the comparative notion in it and is a way of distributing differences that's built into the way we think about education. And I'll be happy to sort of argue that with anyone who wants to. What forms are being given to the projections of kinds of people and training of subjectivities in the algorithms of AI? Again, it's an open question. I don't have it, but it seems to me an important question that, at least in terms of the kind of work I want to do, it's important to ask about education. So with that, our method is ended, and any tips you have to end better than this, I'll take it, but I'm ending. And then somewhere I think I have in there, it's time to go have coffee and food. Yeah. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Popkewitz, for the thought-provoking, inspiring, and kaleidoscopic keynote speech. I want to reflect just for a moment myself, and then we're going to open for some questions for you. So I'm going to make a comment. I'm stalling. I want to give you a second to think about the questions and comments that you're going to ask, Professor. You've given me a different lens through phantasmograms, these contrasts, of making sense of my U.S. high school experience in rural Kentucky, of navigating what we call high school cliques between the jocks, the sports folk, the nerds, the academically talented, the geeks, the technologists, the delinquents, the baddies, the teachers, or the epistemic guards, the ones who carry the knowledge, the guards, the physical guards, the ones that discipline, and how these elements were not just tangential to my experience in high school, but fundamental to making certain kinds of people subjectivities. They're imaginary projections of what is and is not the good life, and where I go forward from the end of that high school experience. So I want to thank you very much for that, and let's open it now to some questions. I have a microphone we'll bring around. So if you raise your hands, those who would like to ask some questions, and I'll bring you a microphone. Okay, we have one question.
Thank you, Professor, for your insightful presentation, as well as kind of providing us with the moment to reflect on how such natural norms and understandings of how we deal with education is actually a historical and a very complex construct in its own order. And my question relates to this kind of critical reflection you have provided with us and its role in this new post-human era. Some folks in Seoul National Universities has also been critically trying to analyze the role of AI and what kind of imageries and pattern recognition it forces the educators and students to have in their ordinary educational practices. And our question is starting to converge into, okay, so we are doing this kind of critical reflection. So what would be the next question? Because the very modernist epistemology and the human being that we try to criticize with embodied in the AI discourse is also the very logical reason behind our critical reflection. Modernist humans were always think to have the rational potentiality to reflect on our own practices and criticize and move on to the next thing. So, but when we're talking about AI and post-humanism, I think we are stuck in a line, and I have always felt that I was stuck in line on that, being critically reflective. And we're just practicing another form of modernist human epistemology and competency, so to say, in a very traditional method of engaging with this new technological wonder that could also possibly provide us with a new way of interacting or understanding our own subjectivity. So long story short, what kind of how do we move on from this modernistic-centered criticality and reflective type of engagement with the AI into something more adequate to the post-human era? I'm sorry for the infrastructural crumblings over here.
Thank you very much for a brilliant presentation and brilliant points, and they totally resonate with how I view the predicament we're in right now. But I'm also teaching students to go out and teach. So the next question for me is, so what do we do? If this is the case, I completely agree that schools are much more about making people than about learning. But which kinds of people should we then try to make? I'm being aware of that. The next question, taking that seriously as an educator, you want to make you want to do your best to attain or to work towards the good people, not in the healthy or not, but in what is the virtuous people. So what should we do now, and what are those virtuous people that we could work for?
Thanks, Thomas, for your presentation. It gave me language to think about this issue in my future. And my question is about, as you pose the question, the open question, what kind of knowledge is reproduced and what kind of certain types of ordering or subjectivity is reproduced by AI? If that is the question that we're going to ask in the future and in the present, do you think as an educational researcher, educational leaders, do we have to or can we interfere with that kind of functioning of AI? Thank you.
I have multiple thoughts, and I'm not sure where to start. I started. The question of what do you do? I'm reminded of two different things. One is I don't know. But that's part of the question. And that's part of what I was trying to raise. But I was also thinking, is this another modernist? Of course it's a modernist question. How do you step out of that? There's I wrote a book on cosmopolitanism, and in writing the book, I had to read about the Enlightenment. And because at least when I was writing the book, I realized that almost all of the educational literature that I was reading was built upon Enlightenment ideas, but nobody really referenced it and gave it any articulation. And so I started reading, and I realized that the Enlightenment, the kind that we tend to think of related to modernity, is the Enlightenment of the planning, a particular sort of Kantian notion. And there's another part of the Enlightenment, which is actually the early Marx, but it wasn't only Marx, which is to raise questions. There's it's a German historian, I think his name is Blumberg, and that thinking of asking questions and engaging in a critical thought, and I'm not talking about the Frankfurt School here, is as much a part of thinking about change than trying to organize and change itself. And I'll use Foucault here, where he says one of the problems is how do you unthink so you can begin to think about alternatives. And to think about alternatives doesn't mean to quickly lapse into the question of what do I do? And so I can't answer the question of what I do. I can answer the question of a lot of the things we do today are dangerous and we need to be very careful of them. And I'm raising the question of how do we understand those dangers to try to come to some ways of dealing with it. I don't have the solution. If I had the solution, I would be driving, what kind of car would I be driving? Really a very expensive car. And I'm okay with that. I think one of the problems is we want to immediately find solutions. And that's that kind of modernism I want to sort of question. And this has to do with teacher education too, because I have worked in teacher education. People have an obligation to get out into school and they have to do something in the school, and there's a whole culture of the school that they have to somehow deal with, so people let them go into the school. That's the same moment when I look at teacher education is not about asking questions. I mean, teacher education is about trying to tell you you have all the answers already. And it's built upon models that I find, for example, when I talked about the alchemy, that need to be rethought. And so the question is, how do you rethink it? How do you, in a sense, try? Then my last part of that question is Stuart Hall, when he says there's no guarantees. And you have to live with no guarantees. That we live with uncertainty, but it means we have to continually try. So it doesn't mean you give up, but it also doesn't mean that the first question that you're going to ask is, what do I do? Because I think then you fall back into the trap of the very things you're trying to undo. I don't know if I answered all of it, but again, and maybe going back to my example of, as a way of summarizing all of it, is this friend of mine who is, he's actually, a book is coming out of University of Michigan where he talks about the origins of the internet. And it's all accidental. So it doesn't, and so how do you, as educators, how do we, but not only educators, how do we deal with the accidental as a way of coming and thinking about the world we live in and try to undo the things that are not doing the things we want? One of the things for me embedded in here is this idea of how we compare. We don't compare, we think the multiculturalism that Jihan is talking about. The idea is how do you create a better world, but it's built upon the very kind of esteems that recreate those very things you want to not have, which is how you build in exclusions in the very notions of inclusion. And so I want to disrupt that. And that notion of disruption is also a way of thinking about change. And so you have to also begin rethinking what is the theory of change that's operating. And that's where the posthumanism does come in. One of the problems for me very often when I go, this was in the session that Wei was here, gave at AERA last year, is that not her talk, but all the other talks were talking about posthumanism, but they were talking about it in a way of reinscribing the very notions of humanism that they were trying to critique. And so for me, if you want to deal with what you do, you have to also deal with what you're doing. How about that?
Okay, thank you, Professor. Please note one announcement here. There is a poster session that's going to be accompanied by refreshments in the lobby here from now until 2:30. So we encourage active participation by everyone. Thank you all very much. This is the end of the second keynote.